First step of removal is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Phillips head screws. After removing the cover, we unplug this and we test for 12 volts. The 12 volt source should be the orange wire, and of course your ground is a black wire. The two blue wires are signals for your speaker. Yes, we have 12 volts with the radio on, so that means the box under the dash is working. This amp is what's not working to give it signal. So now we pull up this carpet to expose the screws underneath. Next, we have to take out these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 screws. For this repair, you only need to replace the electrolytic capacitors. The brown ones, which are the larger capacitors, they rarely, if ever, go bad. In lieu of buying specific capacitors, I went on Amazon and bought this kit. And as you can see, it has all the capacitors I need. So the electrolytic capacitors are a 47 microfarad 16 volt, a 1 microfarad 50 volt, and a 10 microfarad 16 volt. And it's morning, so coffee. It's tricky on this one, measured in capacitors, when it's still on the board, because they're in, I can't tell if they're in series or parallel, because you can't see what's going on, but they are definitely messing with each other and you can't get a good reading. Also, the coating that they put on the board doesn't help with getting a good reading either. So we're going to start, and we're going to change these smaller green capacitors. So I read different forums, and those are the electrolytic capacitors. The big brown ones, rarely if ever go bad, so you don't have to worry about those, just the green little guys. So if you circle around, you can make sure that the voltage is correct. That's very important. You do not want to exceed the voltage, but then also make sure your microfarads are correct whenever you're picking out capacitors. One thing I failed to mention was having a good set of needle nose pliers. I like these little guys when I'm working with tighter stuff. I pulled the capacitor out, and my plan was to pull these capacitors out and check them, but I pulled the leg of it out because I was working on it with channel locks. So, lesson learned. Well, we have all the capacitors changed out now. I did take out that little brown one that I mentioned earlier, shouldn't need to be changed. I took it out just to try to test it, and sure enough, it was a good one, which I'm glad, because I was kind of planning on not having to replace it, so I didn't have a 4.7 microfarad capacitor at 35 volts in my little kit here, so I'm glad it tested out good. So we've got all the capacitors changed out, all the tails have been cut off, so it's time to stick her back in the car and see if we get any sound from her. Since we're just doing a quick test, I didn't fully install it yet. We're just going to plug the board in very carefully, and then we're going to plug into here very carefully. Alright, make sure nothing's touching metal. Wish us luck. Music to my ears, literally. Working on the passenger side speaker now. There's a screw here. Don't forget about these two screws along the outside of the door jamb, and this back piece pops up. I went ahead and took this whole black trim piece off right here. There's that screw I first pointed to down here. There's one more right here, and that trim piece comes off, which makes this lift up and pull out very simply. It's a lot easier than trying to stretch 30-year-old plastic. And there's your speaker right there. You probably want to also go ahead and test the orange and black wire here to make sure you have 12 volts. If you had it in the back, you should have it up here, because it shouldn't be the box issue, especially if you're like me and all 4 speakers aren't working. But when I first got the car, this one worked just a little bit, so that's kind of what told me it wasn't the box in the beginning. But I would always go ahead and check for 12 volts. Once you get the speaker out, you'll notice on top there's some sticky rubberized type tape that seals up that hole. This hole right here. So on my car, the tape kind of stinks a little bit and it's super old and brittle. So I'm going to replace it. Take 4 of these screws right here, and that gives you the amplifier. And then you've got 4 Phillips head screws to take the amplifier off this cover after we unplug it. Now we can take and carefully pry this cover off. And voila, we've got it. Now we have to take, see that glue looking silicone stuff? That has to be removed off the top, and then we will replace again these green Mylar capacitors. We don't have to replace the brown ones, just the green ones. All the new capacitors are in. I'm a little more nervous about this one, less confident than I was the first one I did. I had exactly 1 capacitor test out bad that I tested when I took them off. I went ahead and tested them all just to make sure, and I only have 1 that turned out bad. The rest of them were all good. Now, all it takes is 1, and this is the speaker that was still working when I got the car. So it may make sense, but I'm a whole lot less confident. So let's put it all back together and see what happens. I have the speaker plugged in. It's just kind of wobbly because all we're doing is testing. Let's see what happens. Nothing. Nothing in the back, nothing in the front. Something different's going on. Well, I found a problem. I don't know if it's the problem or not, but I only had 10 volts coming in. And I looked and tried to crank the car wouldn't crank. I left the ignition on and drained the battery. So I got a trickle charger on there now, because that's all I have. And we'll let her charge up and try again when I get 12 volts. I know it's only been a few seconds for you, but it's been about a week and a half for me since you saw me last. Since the low voltage problem on the passenger front speaker. Since then, which obviously was not a problem, as you probably know already, but since then I went ahead and replaced the capacitors on the driver rear speaker. And when I did that, the speaker made a real loud sound like that. I'll show it right here. So then I pulled out the brain box under the dash and I checked it, and everything checked out with it as far as I could tell. So I replaced the capacitors in the front left side, the front driver side amplifier, and lo and behold, it started working. So what I'm about to do is take that speaker and amplifier combo and plug it in the 3 other locations, and if it works in all 3 of those locations, then I know there's something else wrong with the amplifier besides just the electrolytic capacitors. So as you can see, that speaker worked in all 4 corners, so it's clearly not the brain box, it's the speakers. So since we're having an issue with the speaker, I pulled the board back out and checked these 2 larger capacitors. The 820 microfarads with 16 volts, and both of those tested out okay. So I'm not sure what else to do next. I did go ahead and test out that little guy, the one in the middle between the 2 greens. That's the only other one that we didn't change, and it tested fine as well. So I'm out of electrolytic capacitors to test. I've been trying and testing and trying, and I got that speaker, the passenger rear speaker, which was the original one that was working, and then it stopped working for some reason. So I took the large capacitors out of it and tested them. They tested good. I put them back in, and lo and behold, she's working again. And then the driver floor, the front speaker in the driver, is working. That was the one that I took around and checked all 4 corners. So I still have 1 front and 1 rear that are not working. The capacitors tested fine, so I don't know if there's another component or what that I need to be looking for. I guess time for my plea for help. Does anybody know what else I can do besides sending off each amplifier and getting it fixed somewhere else? Any other ideas on components I can change?